Can the United States of America take and defend the high ground of the space domain? That's the question. Will we establish the United States Space Force at the direction of President Donald J. Trump as we should immediately, or will we drag our feet? Well, that's what we're talking about today on The Rob Maness Show. Space Force. You can't do it on the cheap. The Defense Department just finished up its latest Space Week on the heels of the first congressional hearings and testimony on President Trump's Space Force Strategic Initiative. As Acting Defense Secretary Shanahan said at the 35th National Space Symposium in Colorado Springs, a space architecture that is resilient, responsive, and ahead of the threat is what we were building. This architecture not only includes the Space Force, but also the Space Development Agency and a reactivated Functional Combatant Command, U.S. Space Command. Unfortunately, even though the time has come to create the Sixth Service in the war fighting domain of space, many general officers, space defense policy elites, and politicians are condemning the move. In a recent op ed at Forbes.com, the president of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, retired Lieutenant General Dave Deptula, said, creating a new Space Force is unnecessary. The U.S. Air Force already performs this mission through one of its major commands, Air Force Space Command. Creating a new armed service to provide personnel to conduct space operations would duplicate those efforts. General Deptula, who I respect to the highest degree as a strategist, operational planner, and combat aviator, goes on to list all the reasons why we should reject the president's direction. First, the U.S. Space Force proposal does nothing to consolidate the numerous stovepipe space capabilities that are spread across the federal government. It simply creates another one. Second, a prerequisite to creating a new armed service is the ability to arm that service and, by extension, that service's ability to use those arms to achieve military effects commensurate with those of the other armed services. Third, personnel staffing requirements are yet to be determined and costs are ill defined. Fourth, the plan itself was rushed and has glaring problems. There's still much uncertainty as to what the problems the stand up of a separate armed force for space will solve. A more deeply considered and deliberate approach is essential to guard against unintended consequences. And finally, the risks of a premature space force are significant. Number one, lack of cohesive space power theory will see space assets suboptimized. Two, more personnel and money spent on Space Force organization will divert critical funding from Space Force operations to feed a new bureaucracy. And three, segregation of air and space will undermine the synergy of the well established integrated effects of aerospace operations already resident in the U.S. Air Force. Folks, these arguments have a very familiar ring to them. Looking back to the history of air power development under the United States Army in the early 20th century, one can almost hear the arguments and anger from senior Army generals hurled at the namesake of Deptula's organization, Brigadier General Billy Mitchell. Mitchell was even court martialed for his outspoken advocacy and actions on behalf of creating an American Air Force as a separate military department and armed service. Let's take a look at the bureaucracy first. Contrary to Deptula's objection, the new Space Force is directed to consolidate existing forces and authorities for military space activities as appropriate in order to minimize duplication of effort and eliminate bureaucratic inefficiencies. In Space Policy Directive 4, Establishment of the United States Space Force, the guidance explicitly contradicts the logic of opposition by cleanly separating civilian agencies from military forces. This directive orders elimination of extra bureaucratic inefficiencies, so to create more would be against the president's written order. All of us oppose additional bureaucracy because it hinders preparing for and conducting warfighting. But the directive itself allays those concerns by giving the USSF freedom of action. even to eventually subsume control of the vaunted DoD Space Development Agency we've recently seen the current Secretary of the Air Force so eloquently argue to do sooner rather than later. Second, General Deptula argues the USSF can't be armed. I disagree. The fastest and most efficient capability of the USSF to deliver kinetic combat capabilities to transfer organized, train, and equip responsibilities for our land based intercontinental ballistic missile forces to the Space Force on the front end. Additionally, terrestrial military space launch facilities will be owned and operated by the Space Force, completely opening the door to force application capability from and through the space warfighting domain. A similar argument was used against the early air power advocates until Billy Mitchell, violating orders from the generals and admirals protecting their budget turf, demonstrated definitive destructive air power capability delivered by aircraft against military ships. The worry was showing the weakness of the Navy forces, battleships in particular. Mitchell held that 1,000 bombers could be built for the price of one battleship, making aviation a more economical defense force. And the same might be said for future space scour capability. As a potentially much more economic target destruction capability than bomber and fighter aircraft costing hundreds of billions of dollars each, just as in the early 20th century with concerns of air power, this argument only serves to hinder our country's ability to field the USSF, a risky proposition considering we got caught up in World War II before the U.S. Air Force could be created due to the same foot dragging. We need to get ahead of potential adversaries now instead of willfully going slow due to political, civilian, and military reasons. I'll address opposition arguments about undefined staffing and the uncertainty of the plan at once. These are typical organizational arguments against taking the road less traveled in large government organizations, one of uncertainty while achieving a leading edge and innovative goal. President Trump's an entrepreneur at heart and leads from that perspective. For once, our military and Congress should take his valuable guidance and think like innovators and entrepreneurs so we can win and get ahead of our potential adversaries in this domain. I'm not saying it isn't hard to do or without risk. I'm saying that we're Americans and we do things that are hard when they are the right thing to do, just as President John F. Kennedy said. This is one of those moments. In warfighting, I learned from men like General Chuck Horner and Lieutenant General Deptula that slow is not the better option in achieving victory. We all know the old adage that I'll take a less than perfect plan now rather than a perfect plan later if the timing, the threat from the enemy, and the momentum of my forces drives to my decision to attack at this moment will save lives and win. But this plan is not less than perfect. In fact, we've been going slow, too slow. We're already developing space power theory. But Space Force's spending and budgets face stiff competition for priority in Air Force's budgets. And we've established well understood policies to maintain the synergies concerned about, not only between space and air forces, but also ground and naval forces. In fact, to the last point, the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Army are models to replicate when it comes to maintaining cross domain force synergy. All you have to do is take a look at the record, such as the 1984 Memorandum of Agreement on U.S. Army and U.S. Air Force Joint Force Development Processes, to see the level of effort the Air Force and Army have put into working together to ensure the best American capability meets any enemy on the battlefield. Avoiding the pitfalls and lessons of the USAF and U.S. Army relationships very important for future relations and agreements of the Space Force and the Air Force. Our nation has invested vast amounts of resources and effort to study and document these lessons as a roadmap for the very conditions we face with the USSF today. One example is the 1971 RAND study, Army Air Force Relations. The close air support issue significantly documents the historical disagreements and resolutions to the challenges of maintaining a key synergy between air and ground forces on the battlefield. We are currently in a very slow process, but can move faster, and we should. Let's take a look at just how slow and deliberative. In his published U.S. Army War College paper written 17 years ago, A Separate Space Force, an Old Debate with Renewed Relevance, Army Colonel Kurt Story noted the following. While the Space Commission, created in 2000, stopped short of calling for the near term creation of a military department dedicated to space, it did recognize significant shortcomings in the current organization and management of space assets. The Commission established that the Department of Defense requires space systems that can be employed in independent operations or in support of air, land, and sea forces to deter and defend against hostile actions directed at the interests of the United States. In the midterm, a Space Corps within the Air Force may be appropriate to meet the requirement, but eventually a military department, will be required. And essentially, Story notes there's a clear parallel between the Space Commission's conclusion that there will be a need for a separate space service and the evolutionary reorganization of the Army Air Corps into the U.S. Air Force in the 40s. But the question is, are we premature in establishing the U.S. Space Force? We are well beyond the near term and potentially in the midterm, and I posit that we need to do it now. We can no longer ignore as a warfighting domain space. That domain is being challenged by our potential adversaries. Now the Air Force can maintain its air power capability while facing massive overtake of the Space Force's budget has already occurred. These realities push us presently into the long term realm Story describes as the old bureaucratic opposition arguments don't live up to this reality. Unlike the prematurity argument and others used against air power before creation of a separate service, we can't and shouldn't accept the increased risk and fail to create the USSF sooner rather than later. We would only be letting ourselves be lulled into a false sense of security. The lessons of the past are clear. After World War I, air power advocates wanted Congress to create an independent Air Force, but senior Army and Navy leaders were able to convince Congress that the formation of an independent air service was premature. And we entered World War II without the best organization and combat doctrine possible, costing lives and resources. As Story concludes, a clear precedent has been set. The short term, mid-term, and long term recommendations of the Space Commission mirror the evolution and reorganization of the Army Air Corps into the Air Force. We must move forward now and with full speed, establishing the U.S. Space Force as directed by President Trump. Story's direct quote from former U.S. Space Command Commander and U.S. Air Force General Chuck Horner in 1997 is the appropriate predicate for America's sound and responsible path forward on the Space Force. I quote, "If the Air Force clings to its ownership of space, then trade-offs have to be made between air and space, when in fact the trade-offs should be made elsewhere." Our special guest on the show today is Mr. Bart Marquez, former career Foreign Service officer under the Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Clinton administrations, and a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Energy under the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Marquez is here to help us step through the pro and con arguments for and against the establishment of the United States Space Force under President Trump's policy directive number 4 for space. Bart, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rob. It's nice to be back with you.
Well, let's get right into it. The president of the Mitchell Institute, retired Air Force Lieutenant General Dave Deptula, came out with a Forbes.com op-ed this past couple of days, and he's opposed to the establishment of a U.S. Space Force. He does think the reestablishment of the U.S. Space Command is the right thing to do, but absolutely is adamant about not creating the Space Force itself, which I happen to disagree with, but I'm interested in your views on that.
Sure. You know, it's not surprising that somebody who had spent his entire career in the Air Force, and once you get above the rank of flag officer, your job is to fight as much for budgets as it is for control of a battlefield. And he has fought these policy wars and these budget wars. And when he looks at it, I believe, and I don't know him, and I don't mean to be in any way, disrespectful toward him, but I believe that he's looking at it through the eyes of those bureaucratic battles. And what he sees is a huge piece of turf that has been part of the Air Force and has given the generals and the civilians running the Air Force a measure of flexibility, and he sees it being taken away and handed to another bureaucracy. And I think that's unfortunate. I thought that your article was just right on point. You looked at what he said and you said, yeah, I understand where he's coming from. But my gosh, it is time. And in fact, the time is far spent, and it's time we need to get moving on this. And there is a need to have a new and an invigorated force in space, and commanding some of those assets like the ICBMs you mentioned. And you can't run the risk of having space robbed for air command priorities. And that's what will happen if it stays where it is.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I pointed out in the article, and what Army Colonel Story pointed out over 17 years ago in his Army War College paper that I referenced, and that is that General Charles Horner, and look, I highly respect General Horner and General Deptula. I grew up as a young officer under both of them, and they are men that we as commanders, when I became a commander at the lieutenant colonel and colonel level, look to from an operational perspective, a leadership perspective. So I say this with all the respect that I can muster for those guys. But General Horner really had it right in way back in 1997. He said that from a budgetary perspective, the space forces will cause trade-offs to be made between air forces and space forces. And if the Air Force doesn't stop clinging to the ownership of space, then those trade-offs will be made there instead of somewhere else. And that's the issue I think that he was pointing out and what you were just talking about. And from a even more historical perspective, Barton, this is kind of surprised me when I read General Deptula's article, is that he came from it at it from that perspective of the budget. But when the Air Force eventually was created, the Army generals that had been holding on to air for so long and clinging to it, as General Horner pointed out, as the Air Force is doing with space, eventually had to let go of the reins because the budget of the Air Forces was actually greater than the budget of the ground forces. And remember what the Army's mission is to
Mhm.
fight and win America's wars on the battlefield, on the ground. So they were forced to do it. And unfortunately, we went into World War II improperly organized with command relationships and coordination and communication relationships that had not been fully developed in a peacetime environment between World War I and II when they could have been. And I
Mhm.
posit that it cost us more lives and resources because we had to go through that further reorganization actually during the conflict. And eventually the creation of the separate Air Force in 1947 was not an afterthought, but it was almost a fait accompli post World War II because it was obvious at that point. So, uh, my
Yeah,
position is let's be innovative. Let's use the opportunity to be entrepreneurial, like President Trump, and innovative, and step ahead and get ahead of that game so that the adversaries don't have an advantage. If in the case, uneventful as it might be, that we end up going to an all-out war.
yeah, that's right. And since World War II, and during World War II, since that time, we have always had a technological advantage, and it has only increased as time has gone on. I see Russian President Putin trying to suggest that his country has some sort of technological advantage with their hypersonic missile and some of the other new weapons that he has pretended to display. I've noticed that those displays are never full out um, demonstrations of the capability. They could be just illusions. There's a lot of hype around them, and I think that he's trying to cow people into submission by saying, "Look, we are technologically superior to the Americans now." I don't think they are, but I think they're close. Their SAM 400 air defense systems are highly sophisticated, very effective. Uh, and if we do not increase our technological advantage and maintain that technological edge, he will eclipse us. Russian engineers are smart and capable, and they're used to doing a lot with very little resources. And if they gain an advantage, they will invade, they will attack, they will they will move on NATO, on allies outside of NATO, and they'll challenge us to come against them. It's only knowing that we will defeat them that keeps them from doing it. And and investing in the Space Force is a way to maintain that technological edge. And if we don't do it, they will, and then we will be facing a completely different kind of battle than we have faced really in your lifetime or mine.
Yeah, I agree. And it really also, the other level of that, not just technological advantages, is the establishment or the maintenance of deterrence to maintain the peace. You know,
Exactly.
a lot of the modern theorists and academics don't put a lot of stock in deterrence theory, but we've lived it. We've lived nuclear and conventional and chemical weapons deterrence theory. And once deterrence fails, it's very difficult to get it back. That's one of the reasons why folks like us were so concerned when the Russians took Crimea,
Yeah.
and they tried to paint it as an internal operation, as part of, it's part of their country and everything. But they really took part of an established sovereign nation away from that sovereign nation and its people by force. But they did it in a very innovative way, and in a way that and they knew that the president of the United States then probably didn't have the political will or the leadership knowledge from a military perspective to respond effectively, and that's exactly what happened. So
That's right.
we've got to maintain that technological edge in space, and we've got to establish a deterrence effect uh, from space, from the use of the Space Force on the ground here in the rest of the world to shore up alliances like NATO, to shore up our defenses against China, because China is not far behind Russia when it comes to technology, I believe, and on an equal parity with them, and it may be a race for second place, whoever's going to, the race for whoever's going to catch the United States first from that perspective, because the Chinese are very technologically capable, as we all know, and do have large resources. Their economy has
Yeah.
done very well as opposed to the Russians, and the so we've got two fronts really from a national, not national, but from an international and a nation state perspective to establish deterrence on from space. And we should do it while we can do it, so it stays a defensive
You're
capability
right.
instead of having to become an offensive capability in a nanosecond.
That's true. And you bring up a couple of very good points there. One, I smiled when you started talking about the Chinese development of technology, because the old joke is they're always almost exactly 7 or 8 months behind whoever the world leader is, because that's how long it takes them to steal the technology from us, and or from the Japanese or the Russians or the Germans or whoever's developed it. they they're not so good at creating things from whole cloth, but they're awfully good at reverse engineering and then copying. And they are moving steadily throughout the Pacific region and all the way around the Horn of Africa. They're moving into the Atlantic Ocean now, around Mozambique, and Angola. They're moving around Angola and establishing bases. They call it the string of pearls strategy, establishing a string of naval bases all around the coast of Africa. And they're creating aircraft carriers, and they have the ability now to project power outside the Middle Kingdom in a way that they never have. And you also raise the point of deterrence, and that's the real lesson of the Space Force. Um, President Obama did absolutely nothing anytime another country committed aggression, an enemy country committed aggression against a neighbor, and and he practically held the door open for Russia while they invaded one country after another. And it wasn't just the Crimea; it was the eastern Ukraine. And they came up with this phony accusation of persecuted ethnic Russians who were Ukrainian citizens but of Russian origin, and they sent in special forces without insignia, in unmarked uniforms. They called them the Little Green Men. Well, there are attorneys in Latvia right now filing cases one right after another on behalf of ethnic Russians alleging discrimination. and building case after case so that when Russia wants to invade Latvia, they can say they're defending the rights of persecuted ethnic Russians in Latvia. They are doing the same thing in every country that they salted when it was the Soviet Union, and they ran Eastern and Central Europe, and they brought in, I call it, it's like salting the mine. They salted these countries with Russians, and those Russians and their descendants are now there, and they are ready to be provocateurs. They're ready to say, yeah, we're victims, come save us. And that gives Russia a plausible motive for coming in to save their people. Well, the ultimate deterrence is the will of the President of the United States. And by President Trump's decision to invest in the Space Force, he's saying, listen, we're serious about deterrence, we're serious about development, and if you mess with us, we will destroy you. And the Space Force is just one more plank in that platform, or bulwark in that, piling in that bulwark against aggression. And making the commitment that he has made is what is signaling to Putin, to the Chinese, to say, to the Iranians, to everybody else, to say, we are serious about deterrence, we're serious about winning wars, and we will do whatever it takes. And we are 15 years ahead of where you are, so don't even think about it.
Yeah, it's have you noticed that Colonel Putin, the KGB colonel, he still acts like a KGB colonel. It's a lot less expensive to operate networks that you've salted and seeded in the countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union than it is to
Yeah.
actually invade and take control of them. So he's learned a lot from becoming out from behind communism, but he's still a KGB colonel, and he's running those intelligence networks and intelligence operative networks as a way to establish control in those countries. And I believe that's one of the reasons why NATO, it's critical that the NATO countries pony up their fair share of what they've signed up to on defense spending,
Yes.
and why the president is exactly right on target for insisting they do that and publicly holding them accountable, because previous presidents have not. They've wanted to be the Mr. Nice Guy. And matter of fact, Trump gets criticized daily, I think, for not being nice to our allies. There's a Republican primary challenger that came out this week, William Weld. He was Libertarian last presidential election. Now he's a Republican again, and he actually said that, Mr. President, can't you just be, not insult our allies in public? Well, our allies have been insulting us for years, and they've been robbing the American taxpayer. And the president of the United States was elected because we've had enough of that. But
Yeah.
but get to the future of space and future of the Space Force. Do you see, as I do, on the horizon, an actual effective economical defense system being established by the Space Force that can either be on orbit or quickly placed on orbit within a matter of an hour or even minutes? Or even if we have the intelligence that shows us somebody's going to shoot weapons through the space domain. I mean, I see that as the opening of that window that this term that used to be called Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, missile defense systems, all those things that you hear these things called. If we actually establish a real space force that's capable of getting on orbit quickly, or staying on orbit, keeping our defenses on orbit all of the time and being activated in just a minute's notice, then we could have a highly effective global defense system to prevent adversaries from using the space domain to do things like fire intercontinental ballistic missiles through it
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
instead of these piecemeal things.
Yeah, that's the real key, is the ICBMs. Can we shoot them down, intercept them somehow on their upward trajectory rather than as they've reached their apogee and they're falling down over our country? If the people who are thinking of firing them off know that they're going to be shot down over their own country, they'd be a little more hesitant to press those two buttons to fire them.
That's right, and that's exactly how deterrence works. And I would posit that the math is easier to accomplish from the high ground, uh, looking down at the upward trajectory of a missile than it is from attacking it from below.
I learned
So
that the hard way throwing dirt clods at my brother when I was a little kid. Somehow he always managed, he was a year and a half older than me, and he figured out that high ground bit long before I did. And I always had to throw up, and he always got to throw down. And I tell you, it was a very one-sided fight.
absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Bart. And ladies and gentlemen, that's you've heard it right there. What the Space Force does for the United States of America and freedom-loving people and allies around the world is we have the opportunity to take our defenses to the high ground and take that high ground in peace and establish defense so that we have no more war. And that is the whole key to military forces is to deter war and prevent it from happening. This is the Rob Maness Show. We'll see you next week.